FSB, state security as the core of Putin's regime. How the party regime of the USSR evolved to the state security regime of Russian Federation and how latter is different from the former. It's the mafia state, not the ideologues state. That's Putin celebrating the day of state security worker. Indeed, the domination of state security, the new nobility over all other institutions, is a particular feature of Putin's regime, which hadn't been the case in USSR. State security rule as the major innovation of Putin. Thread: USSR wasn't run by the state security, it was run by the party. The party was the supreme institution controlling all others, including KGB. Party had its cells in every KGB office, which had to control KGB and report on it. KGB activities were checked by the party commissars. Of course, cadre decisions in KGB were done by the party. Since the cleansing of Beria's henchmen in 1950s, KGB was never ever led by career KGB officers. All the KGB chiefs were political appointees from the party nomenclatura. They were always outsiders. Suits. Consider Andropov, now regarded as a patron saint of the KGB. What was his track? Firstly, Komsomol, of course. Then the party work in Karelia, then diplomatic service, then a secretary of Central Committee of the party, and only at the age of 53 he is appointed as the KGB chief. Here's a good illustration of how the party state is run. You have state institutions which are theoretically powerful, but that's an illusion. All the cadre decisions, all the policy making is run by a political organization, the party. The party is subject. The rest are objects. The USSR was the best known and a kind of model party state, but it wasn't the first. The functional model of such a regime was first built in the Ottoman Empire in 1908 to 1913 as a result of what is incorrectly called the Young Turk Revolution, which is not a very good term. To start with, the name Young Turks was invented by French journos. The real name was the Committee for Union and Progress, which reflects the vibrant ideology. We represent science and reason, which is the source of our legitimacy rather than tradition or elections. It was a hierarchical organization with positivist ideology, party discipline, ruled by the Central Committee. They never won elections and in 1908 to 1913 were formally in opposition, which didn't fool anyone. Everyone knew decisions are made by this party, not by the ruling one. So all the state institutions, including the monarchy and the army, were submitted by a very ideological political party which ruled in the name of reason, and that worked, which had profound cultural impact on many countries, but most importantly on Russia. Let me introduce Buffett's concept of institutional inertia. We greatly exaggerate both originality and independence of our thought. We are not that original. If we do something, it's 99% because we already saw that someone else did it and it worked. We're very imitative species. Interest groups in Russia, fascinated by the success of the committee, started calling themselves Young Turks, hoping to imitate their success. Most importantly, it was a group of ambitious military officers led by the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, right, uncle of the Tsar. Dismissal of Nikolai Nikolaevich and the assumption of commander-in-chief role by Nicholas II greatly exacerbated the conflict, especially considering that most of influential generals were appointees of the Grand Duke. Since November 1916, generals were contemplating Tsar's arrest. If they wanted to imitate the Young Turks' success, they were mistaken. In chaos that followed Tsar's abdication, most of them died, often in horrible manner. Ultimately it was another underdog group of ideologues that hijacked the state and built the party regime, the Bolsheviks. For decades the party regime stood strong. It controlled the state, controlled the army, controlled the state security. After Stalin's death the party purged the state security with certain vindictiveness, making sure these guys would never ever dare to touch nomenclatura. But by the late 1970s bad symptoms started appearing. The most obvious one was gerontocracy. Bosses simply grew old, dysfunctional and refused to go. But there were less obvious markers of decline. Soviet Constitution of 1977 said in Article 6, the party is the leading and organizing force, the core of the state. Party determines the general direction of progress, foreign and domestic policy of USSR, gives scientific, evidence-based character to its fight for communism. Previous constitutions were different. The one of 1924 didn't mention the party at all. 1936 one mentioned it only in the Article 126 as one of many NGOs. Only in one phrase it specified that the party represents the leading core of all organizations, but it was kinda low-key. The less belief in communism remained, the more clearly had the party to specify its role. In the heyday of the USSR, its rule was based on the implicit, unwritten law. During the decline it became explicit, written one. The rise in formal authority equals decline in actual power, which reflects a more general, me to rule, omnis determinatio estate negatio equals every determination is a negation. If you clearly define your authority, that looks like a powerful move, but it's not. Firstly, if you were really that powerful, why would you even need to say it out loud? Secondly, counterintuitively it may sound, every such definition is a point of failure. Whatever determined by a statute, can and will be abolished by a statute. By defining your privilege, you give your rivals clear concept of what they are fighting with and a target to attack. It's so much harder to fight against vague and elusive than with what your enemy had so conveniently defined and put as a target. Once the party rule was codified as the Article 6 of the Constitution, it became such a target. In 1989, Article 6 was abolished. The party fell. After the fall of the USSR, many demanded the full-scale lustration of KGB or even of the party as a whole, like in Eastern Europe, which didn't happen, of course, for the obvious reason that all people who mattered within the new regime had been party members and many had KGB past. Instead, new President Yeltsin broke KGB into a number of organizations. FSB did foreign intelligence. FSO guarded the president. FSB managed data and communications. What remained from KGB was first called as MB, Ministry of Security, and then FSK, Counterintelligence Service. This was largely divide impera logic. Let them fight and the president ruled them all. What was the hierarchy of these services? FSK was the lowest. Less paid, less privilege, lesser rank. FSO, FSB and SV are ranked higher. The top one was New Presidential Security Service. It was led by Kozhakov, super powerful guy of that era. He was a minor KGB officer assigned to guard Yeltsin, then a regular party boss. Once Yeltsin was fired and started his contest for power, Kozhakov became his main gun. After Yeltsin's victory he became all-powerful. Kozhakov didn't only guard the Yeltsin, he controlled access to the body, which means everything in Russia. Within few years, all main intelligence services were led by his appointees, Kozhakov being the main Silovik, a boss using force, of that age. Kozhakov was an old companion of Yeltsin, but he was erratic, unreliable, extremely corrupt. It was not only that he used his powers mostly for self-enrichment, it's that he was very dysfunctional as the chief of security. While being a good bodyguard, he was a terrible manager. There were two main events in state security history. First, the downfall of Kozhakov. Yeltsin faced elections in 1996 with like 6% approval rate. What shall we do? Kozhakov said, disband parliament and rule by force. Of course he wanted it. That would increase his personal power. Civilian administration, most importantly, Chubey disagreed. Let me use some street magic, said Chubey, and I'll secure your victory, no matter the approval rate. Kozhakov was angry, of course. If Chubey manages the re-election, it would make him more powerful, and Kozhakov less. Few days after the first indecisive election tour, Kozhakov's officers arrested two Yeltsin's campaign staffers. They were leaving the government house with a Xerox box filled with $538,000 cash. A huge scandal followed. Of course it was dirty money for Yeltsin's re-election. Kozhakov hoped this sabotage will destroy the regular re-election campaign and make Yeltsin accept Kozhakov's idea on how to secure the power. Instead, it destroyed him. After this Xerox affair, Yeltsin fired Kozhakov and purged his appointees from all the security services. Xerox affair was a major milestone. It showed Yeltsin that current leadership of state security was untrustworthy. They got to go. Another milestone was the First Chechen War, which Russian forces lost badly despite huge superiority. The security apparatus was dysfunctional. Thus Yeltsin starts to restore security apparatus to its former flurry. In 1995, the largest of KGB remnants, FSK, was renamed to the FSB. From the counterintelligence to the security service, agenda changed. Counterintelligence is specific, while security is about everything. Many perceive the rise of Putin as a sort of historical aberration, and yet, all three last prime ministers of Yeltsin were career intelligence officers. Primakov was, Stepashin was, and finally Putin was. It's not an accident, it's deliberate policy. Promote state security. It looks as if around 1998 Yeltsin made up his mind that he's gonna delegate power to the former KGB establishment and was just looking for someone reliable and trustworthy. It's difficult to interpret the cadre policy by the end of his reign otherwise. All three last PMs, from KGB, the appointment of Putin as the FSB chief was clearly in line with his promotion strategy. He raised the salaries and ranks of the FSB to FAPSI and SVR level. He allowed FSB leadership to privatize much of KGB real estate in Moscow, which immediately turned them into millionaires. In December 1999, during the Checkers Day celebration, new Prime Minister Putin declared, "I want to report that a group of FSB agents infiltrated into the government for the undercover work are dealing with their task well." Not quite true. He was appointed rather than infiltrated. And yet, Putin's message, though presented as a joke, was powerful. We, state security, did successfully hijack the state. We've been hound dogs of the party once, but the party's gone and now we'll become what the party used to be. We are now the only subject, the rest are objects. New FSB chief Patrushev, an old Petersburg pal, told that his agents comprise the new nobility. That's important. State security is very unideological. They strive for power, for money, for status. They may have grown in the USSR, but they want to be aristocrats. In a sense, FSB took functions of the party. The party permeated all institutions and controlled them through their commissars. Now FSB sent its overwatches everywhere from the ministries to the private banks. It's now the leading and organizing power which the party used to be. There are certain differences, however. For the party bosses it was really hard to cash out. They were powerful, but not rich. That's why most of Soviet patriciates inherited from their forefathers only their apartments. Meanwhile, FSB bosses and their families became really rich. Another difference is the lack of ideology. Of course, there are certain tendencies: statism, orthodox observance, Russian ethno-nationalism. And yet, that's far less important than Soviet ideology for the party. In fact, state security was more statist than Marxist even back then. And finally, the FSB is different from the party in one crucial respect. The party aimed to lead society to progress through science and reason. This path was bloody, and yet, they actually built stuff, like a lot of stuff, because in their heyday they were obsessed ideologues. The state's security are different. They aren't obsessed. Thus they build only what they consider vital, which is securing the export of raw materials, including 1. Seaports to export commodities, 2. Railways to bring commodities to seaports, 3. Pipelines, and nothing else matters. In a sense, that marks return to normality, securing 1. Sources of raw goods, 2. Export routes for raw goods, has been the focus of Russian political economy at least since 1550s. But for now I want to stress, all projects of Russian industrialization and so on are bees. Economists who write all of this presume that Russia is still run by ideologues, religious fanatics like in the 1930s, but it's not. State security are more like mafia than like Bolsheviks, which means FSB is passive. On a surface level, this is reflected in export revenues being spent on London real estate rather than on plants or dams. But if we think in the higher orders, Bolsheviks wanted to change everything, while FSB would prefer everything to stay the same, which is why I'm skeptical about the prospects of Putinism. FSB is a service created to prevent wrong changes. Of course it evolved into a service preventing any changes. But in a world subject to entropy, consistent conservatism is 100% defeatist. End of thread.